the texts, or at least the stories behind them. But for all the ones that I'm giving in the middle, I'll give you plenty of English cues for that. I'm going to be taking you on a tour through a little bit of the history of Pennsylvania Dutch, the significance of the language for its speakers, and I'll leave some time at the end for some questions and some answers. But I want to start off with a nice sample of Pennsylvania Dutch, where I won't give you the English, but you should know the storyline here. This is taken from a collection of children's Bible stories that were written by some Ohio Amish in Pennsylvania Dutch. For those of you that have had German before, and you've never seen Pennsylvania Dutch written down, and you know that Pennsylvania Dutch is connected to German somehow, you look at the spelling there, and you think it doesn't look very German-like, does it? And when Pennsylvania Dutch is written nowadays, especially by folks out in Ohio who are interested in publishing books, including teaching materials in Pennsylvania Dutch, they often follow English spelling rules. And at the end of my presentation, I'll be talking about the translation of the Bible, the complete Bible, New and Old Testament, that was finished in 2013, that uses the same materials, spelling materials, as what we have here. So this is as I say, this is from a collection of Bible stories for children. This would be pretty much how you would expect to hear folks in Ohio and places like right out here in Iowa. So Midwestern Amish and Old Order Mennonites tell the creation story, the beginning of the creation story in Pennsylvania Dutch. The name of the book is Welle Lezen, let's read, and the subtitle is Bijbel Stories voor Kinderen, right? Bible stories for children. So let's listen to the beginning of the creation story told in Pennsylvania Dutch. De staat van die aard. Wie lang terug ons geen aard gehad, geen lijk, geen helling. Es war alles juist dunkelgras. Versterben mit hat Gott die Himmel und die Erde gemacht. Nur gesagt, lass es Licht sein. Erst wie Sel war es Lichtwärts. Gott hat das Licht da gekäse und es dunkle Nacht. Das war nur der erste Tag, das Leben war. Den nächsten Tag hat die Wolke gemacht. Hat auch die Luft gemacht, so dass man schnaufen kann. Auf den dritten Tag hat das Wasser und das Land verdient. Hat die See und die Himmel gemacht, selber Tag. Hat noch gesagt, lass die Bäume ins Grasstelle wachsen. Und sie haben noch Stelle wachsen. So that's a nice sample of modern Pennsylvania Dutch. How many folks there can understand it reasonably well? All right, and for those of you that don't have a Pennsylvania Dutch or German background, do you recognize some of the words? Maybe because of the similarity with English, maybe just a few words, and there are a handful of English words thrown in there as well. So what is Pennsylvania Dutch? Pennsylvania Dutch is not a dialect of German. It's historically related to German, but it's a language that developed in colonial Pennsylvania in the 18th century, in the 1700s. It's got migration connection background to Germany and to a very, very specific part of Germany. How many folks have been to Germany? Anybody here been to Germany before? Ooh, lots of hands coming up. It's from a region that's known as, in German, the Pfalz, or the Palatinate, near the modern day city of Mannheim, Germany. So if you were to fly into Frankfurt, which is one of the big hubs in Germany, just take a short train ride and you're down in Mannheim, and that's the area where the dialects are most similar to Pennsylvania Dutch. But there's no single village in that region where you can go in and you say, aha, that's where they speak Pennsylvania Dutch. Because as I say, Pennsylvania Dutch is a language that really developed in this country. And it was in the cradle of that, we say, is in the Dutch country of southeastern Pennsylvania. Now, a lot of people connect Pennsylvania Dutch with Amish folks and Old Order Mennonites, which makes a lot of sense because the vast majority of the active speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch are in fact members of the Old Order Amish and Old Order Mennonite churches. But going way, way back, and even certainly in the 1700s, but into the first part of the 20th century, the Amish and Old Order Mennonites only comprised a very, very small minority of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. The large majority of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers were in fact members of Protestant churches, so mainly Lutheran historically and German Reformed. And in the Pennsylvania Dutch country, they were known as the Fancy Dutch, or the church people, as opposed to the plain Dutch, or the plain people, or the sect people, right? So out here in the Midwest, that kind of distinction has been lost, right? Because essentially all the Pennsylvania Dutch speakers for many, many generations, in fact, have been associated with conservative Anabaptist sects. But in Pennsylvania, there's still several thousand fancy Dutch speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch. There were some smaller groups, so Mennonites and Amish were the largest speakers originally, but then the Dunkards, the so-called the Brethren churches, originally related to the German Baptists, were also part of that mix. Now today, the situation is pretty clear that the vast majority are members of the Old Order Amish and most of the Old Order Mennonite churches. And then some churches that are in the kind of concentric circles outward of the Old Order groups. But Pennsylvania Dutch is in a very, very interesting small club of minority languages in the United States and Canada, spoken by highly traditional religious groups. And some of the groups you'll recognize. So for example, the Hutterites, right? Hutterites speak a form of German, or it's another language that's descended from German, that's just simply referred to as Hutterisch. It's related to dialects that are spoken in the country of Austria today, right? Their ancestors had come from South Tyrolia by way of Austria, Russia, and then eventually to North America and spreading from the United States into Canada. Hutterite German is in the same position as Pennsylvania Dutch, right? It's spoken very, very actively and used alongside German. And for those of you that may have had some experience down in northern Mexico among the old colony Mennonites, and if you've been down to places like Bolivia and Paraguay and Argentina, you know that there are a lot of Low German speakers. Plotich is the way that they refer to their language, and that's known more formally as Mennonite Low German. And then the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Hasidim, and I know that there are some here in Iowa, but especially concentrated in New York City, parts of Israel, and certainly in pockets of Europe still as well. Yiddish is a language which is also distantly related to German, and the active speakers of this language are also very, very loyal to the language as a way of conserving their heritage. So these are small languages that are in a very, very positive situation as far as their overall health. There is no other group of people anywhere on the planet growing more rapidly than the Old Order Amish and Old Order Mennonites, the Hutterites, the Old Colony Mennonites, and the ultra-Orthodox Jews that speak Yiddish. What all these groups share in common is an average family size of about 7 children per family, and retention rates of somewhere between 85, 90, in some cases 95%. So the chances of, say, a child being born to an Amish or Old Order Mennonite family in this country making the decision to eventually join the Old Order Amish Church or an Old Order Mennonite Church are somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 and 90%. That means that the population of the speakers of all these languages is doubling every 20 years. That's the most rapid growth of any human group on the planet, right? There's no higher birth rate and there's no faster rate of growth among any population of language speakers. So Pennsylvania Dutch and these other languages are in a very, very special category. They're spoken by overall small numbers today, but that number has been doubling consistently for the last century and a half. Now, where does Pennsylvania Dutch come from historically? As I say, there's a connection to Germany. And actually this morning we were visiting with a friend of Niles, Old Order Amish man, Vernon Bontrager, and he said, I think it's connected to Schwäbisch, right? How many folks have heard that term before, Schwäbisch or Schwäbisch before? That is a group of dialects that's spoken in Germany that's kind of in between the Palatinate, the Pfalz, where the ancestors of many people in this room actually emigrated from, and Switzerland, right, where many of you folks actually have more distant ancestry. Schwäbisch is located sort of in that kind of lower left area. You can just see it sort of made out there where it's kind of brownish orange there. It's a neighboring dialect group to where Pennsylvania Dutch dialects are most closely related. But in fact, Pennsylvania Dutch is not descended directly from Schwäbisch. So where see that arrow goes, this is a dialect map. This describes the state of the largest spread of German dialects at the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly would have applied to the 18th century. So it's in that area that's basically kind of in the Rhineland area, the Palatinate. Now, what's the secret to maintaining Pennsylvania Dutch, right? Well, there are 3 major factors that correlate with the maintenance of Pennsylvania Dutch and also Hutterite German and Mennonite Low German. So the vast majority of the active speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch, so not only the plain people, but also the fancy Dutch, the so-called church people, is that they did not live in cities and towns. They lived in rural communities. So as soon as Pennsylvania Dutch folks have moved into towns and cities, which was really an issue in southeastern Pennsylvania, so moving into the city of Lancaster, moving into Reading, moving into Allentown, and certainly moving into Philly, the language disappeared after about a generation. Why? Because in a city, you really can't cut yourself off or live in a really, really homogeneous neighborhood such that your language can still be maintained. English wins out. And we see this over and over again in American urban areas. A city like New York City that is home to people that have come from hundreds of different language backgrounds, within a generation, their kids, and then certainly by their grandkids, are going to be speaking predominantly English. So this first secret of keeping Dutch is living in rural areas. The second aspect of that is that you're living in a rural area where you're not just simply one family, but you're in a critical mass surrounded by a number of other speakers of the language, right? And this was true of the Fancy Dutch. It was true certainly of the Plain people. Now the Fancy Dutch and the Plain people did not historically live really very long in the same parts of southeastern Pennsylvania. For those of you that are familiar with that area, Lancaster County was always kind of the Anabaptist hub or concentration area. But then if you move up to the northeast into Berks County, it transitions into Fancy Dutch country, and then one county up above that, Lehigh County, which is where Allentown is, that's pretty much exclusively Lutheran and German Reformed. So the heartland of the Fancy Dutch. Limiting one's formal education, right? Well, the Amish, typically eight grades of formal education. That was this very, very similar situation among the active speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch among the Fancy Dutch, or the church people. And then the next thing, which is the third point, is that marrying somebody who also has the same language background. Now the Amish and older Mennonites have that figured out pretty well, because if you're going to be an active member of the older Amish and older Mennonite churches, that pretty much means that your partner, your spouse, is going to be also a member of the church, or at least from that background. But in situations like, for example, more progressive Mennonites, or members of German Methodist groups, or Lutheran and Reformed, if they grew up with Pennsylvania Dutch, and they married somebody who was of English-speaking background, you could pretty much bet that the language of the family, when they would have kids, would be English dominant, right? So it was something that really both parents would have to be speaking the language in order for it to be maintained. Now another factor that is really, really important as far as maintaining the heritage importance of Pennsylvania Dutch among Plain folks is the fact that it is linked to the continued use of High German or Standard German in worship services. So we see this as an interesting correlation. So for example, churches like the Beachy Amish Church, right, which historically, when they moved away from the old orders in the 1920s, they were all still preaching in German or using German in worship services. And as long as they were doing that, there was still that support there for some form of German for Pennsylvania Dutch to be spoken in the home. But as the Beachies, and similar among the older Mennonites, the so-called Horning Mennonites, or the Weaverland Conference, Black Bumper Mennonites, they've moved in a similar direction. As they've gotten away from using German in worship services, then they're using more English in the home. Because dropping of German in the worship service in favor of English often means that a lot of these churches are more mission-minded, right? They're more reaching out to folks of different backgrounds. And as soon as your church becomes a little bit more mission-minded, the maintenance of Pennsylvania Dutch is not seen as an asset, but as a hindrance to outreach. They say they don't want to see that as a barrier for somebody who's joining, right? And so they prefer English. So it's interesting, the way that Pennsylvania Dutch is described traditionally by both the Lutheran and Reformed, and as well as Plain people that have maintained it, is that it kind of goes hand in glove with continuing the use of German in church. And so it's collectively referred to as die Muttersprache, right? The mother tongue. And the word Deutsch, or Dutch, right, in the Midwest really does mean both Pennsylvania Dutch and German. The two are connected with one another. So just to give you a sense of what the language was like among the Fancy Dutch, there are literally thousands upon thousands of texts, poetry, prose, jokes, religious works, the whole gamut, written in Pennsylvania Dutch by Fancy Dutch starting in the early 1800s. The earliest texts that we found are somewhere around 1806, 1807, that appeared in German language newspapers in Pennsylvania. There is a rich body of literature in Pennsylvania Dutch that is by and large fairly unknown to a lot of Plain speakers of the language today, in part because most of it was produced in Pennsylvania, so folks in the Midwest simply would not have been connected with that, or because simply there were just so few Anabaptists that were writing in Pennsylvania Dutch in the 1800s. There's such a small number there. I want to share with you a poem that expresses the sentiments of Fancy Dutch. And for those of you that are familiar with the Old Orders and sympathetic to the Old Order way of life, you realize that the values are very much on the same wavelength. This was a man named Henry Harbaugh, who was a Reformed minister who had no Anabaptist background whatsoever, but just like the Anabaptists, had ancestors who had originally come from Switzerland by way of the Palatinate and migrated to Pennsylvania in the colonial era. He only lived 50 years. He was born in 1817 and died in 1867. And he left behind a body of poetry that's just beautiful. And I'm going to share you one poem that's a relatively short one. So we've got the Pennsylvania Dutch on the left and the English on the right. The title is Bush and Städte, which means literally country and town. Now keep in mind that I said one of the secrets for maintaining Pennsylvania Dutch actively has been connecting the language with a rural lifestyle, right? So if you're thinking about which side of the fence that Henry Harbaugh is going to go out of his sympathy, he's going to be on the Bush side, right? He's going to be on, and he's going to compare the shtetl negatively to it. So you can read along in the English, and I'll give you the Pennsylvania Dutch on the left. Deel Bushlei hen ke lust heen, sie henkere voor die stad. For my part, ich hab immer noch kein Notion so gehabt. Es mag gut genug im Städtel sein, gib mir das grüne Land. Da ist nicht alles Haus und Dach, nicht alles Straß und Wand. Was hat man in der Stadt für Fried? Es ist nix so Lärm und Jagd. Man hat keine Ruhe den ganzen Tag, kein Schlaf die ganze Nacht. Die Buben gucken matt und bleich, die Mädchen weiß und dünn. Sie haben wahrscheinlich Leder an, aber es ist nichts Rechtes drin. Die Städtler sind zu zimperlich. Sie reagieren nichts an. Sie usen nicht ihre weiße Hände für Fear, es bleibt etwas dran. Mir ist zu wenig Grünes da, keine Blumen und kein Beam. Wenn ich Stund im Städtel bin, dann will ich wieder heim. So that's just one sample of a poem by just one of my favorite poets, but there are literally dozens and dozens of other great writers out there. And part of my task in promoting Pennsylvania Dutch and the awareness of Pennsylvania Dutch is also bringing some of these gems of Pennsylvania Dutch literature back to life, right? Now this could be the first time that Bush and Städte was ever recited in a public venue in Iowa. Who knows, right? Now you've experienced it live. So what happened to Pennsylvania Dutch among both the Anabaptists as well as among the church people? The second half of the 19th century, especially in Pennsylvania, meant some big social changes. The first change was the industrialization. So basically, the percentage of farmer folk in rural America generally, but especially in southeastern PA, dramatically dropped, right? So people were moving off the farm and cities were expanding. You have railroad connections and you have textile mills, all kinds of factories. So the Industrial Revolution hit southeastern Pennsylvania hard. And that meant that the sort of natural barrier, the natural isolation between the country, the bush, and the shtetl, the town, was starting to be broken down. That meant that a lot of people among the Fancy Dutch, or the church people, were moving away from Pennsylvania Dutch because their natural isolation was being lifted. And there were more intermarriages at that time too, between Pennsylvania Dutch speakers and English speakers. And that basically meant that the language would be lost for future generations. Now among many of your ancestors, right? The second half of the 19th century was also a huge change. Think about the Dienerversammlungen, right? Think about the Amish church gatherings and the Mennonite gatherings, and this is where the old order identity is really formed, right? So it's very interesting. So among Amish and Mennonites in the 1870s and 1880s, it was about 2/3 in both groups that went on the more progressive route, and 1/3 that stayed behind, right? Though the stayed behind, their descendants are the old orders today. The 2/3 that left, almost all of their ancestors eventually switched to English. Now, in some places it was faster, some places it was slower. but the fact that so many folks in your congregations in a place like Kelowna are exclusively English speaking, except going back about 3 or 4 generations, that's evidence of that, right? So basically this kind of change in the second half of the 19th century was really the sort of the beginning of the end of Pennsylvania Dutch among those folks that moved closer towards the American social mainstream. But of course, as we've seen before, the old orders have, without planning this, just sort of naturally maintained all the factors that you need, the external factors to be able to protect Pennsylvania Dutch, right? In addition to, of course, speaking English and using German in worship services. Now, just to give a little bit of a Kelowna hook here, because here we are in Kelowna, Iowa. Kelowna has an interesting distinction in the history of the research on Pennsylvania Dutch. The very, very first master's thesis or doctoral dissertation that was ever written on Pennsylvania Dutch as spoken by either Amish or Mennonites was based on field work that was done right here in Kelowna, Iowa. It was a master's thesis that was written by a woman named Ruth Bender, who was a graduate student at the University of Iowa. And basically what she did was she grew up in a Pennsylvania Dutch speaking background herself, although she was not originally from Iowa. She eventually got her doctorate and became a speech language therapist. She became a professor herself later on. She wrote her dissertation called The Kelowna, Iowa, Pennsylvania German Dialect. And this thesis was not widely known except outside of a small group of scholars. She came down here to Kelowna and she spoke mainly to children because she was training to be a speech language therapist. She had a very kind of maternal instinct. She connected well with children. And so she made this very, very long list, these long lists of words. Now in 1973, a professor from Pennsylvania who was a fancy Dutch background, who was actually at Millersville University in Pennsylvania, native speaker of Pennsylvania Dutch and a professor of German, got a hold of this thesis and he said, I want to go out to Kelowna, Iowa, and to see to what extent the language has still been maintained. So he went down and interviewed a number of people in this community to see if he could still find the similarities. And sure enough, he found lots of similarities. And I want to just share a couple of them from this dissertation, from this thesis here. But first I got to give a shout out to a good buddy of mine who was also my sponsor for baptism at Milwaukee Mennonite Church, Steve Hartman Kaiser, who followed up as the next scholar to do research on Pennsylvania Dutch here in Kelowna, Iowa. Steve's folks are sitting right here in the front. His dad is from this area originally. His grandmother, Alta Brenneman Kaiser, you may know as a school teacher in there. I'm seeing a lot of smiles and nodding heads. So this is a map from Steve's book, right, which is derived from his dissertation. Steve did his PhD dissertation at Ohio State University. He's a professor of English linguistics at Marquette University, which is in Milwaukee, and he and his brother are my brethren in Milwaukee Mennonite Church. And this is a nice little map that shows how the Dutch came to Kelowna, Iowa. It shows the migration patterns, and you can just sort of make it out there. On the far right is the cradle of Pennsylvania Dutch, and those two counties that he's highlighted there are Lancaster and Berks County. And if for anybody that's familiar with, say, the original Amish settlements in America, Northkill, Berks County, that's where it all started. And then some migrated down to Lancaster, and then they made this big jump, still in the 1700s, to Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Somerset is very, very important because that was essentially the jumping off point for the migration of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers, mainly Mennonites and Amish, to Ohio and points west, right? So to this day, there are two major dialects of Pennsylvania Dutch among plain people. Those who are who live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, or are affiliated with churches that are in fellowship with Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in some way, and basically the entire West. So from Ohio all the way out here to Iowa and then points west. So really the majority of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers are so-called Western Dutch speakers, right? And so this is and Kelowna was a very, very early point of settlement, but of course we've got Ohio and Indiana and Illinois with early settlements as well. Here are a couple of little tidbits. I love this word, savlo. Savlo. This is a word that is not widely known outside of the Midwest, and it's pretty much unknown in Pennsylvania. Savlo means squirmer. And so here's a sentence that was taken from one of the speakers here in Kelowna. Ich war in Glenal Savlo West, wie in Glenal Buwa. Ich hab just net still say, can I indict me? I was a little squirmer when I was a little boy. I just couldn't be still in church. And here's a little rhymely, a little rhyme. Bist du base, pass my case. Mach een snoet, nou wärts wieder gut. Does that ring any bells for folks here? Recognize some of that? I see a couple of heads nodding there. And this is one that's famous throughout Germany and has a lot of variants, including in Pennsylvania. Righty, righty, guily. But what's interesting is that the variety that was documented here in Kelowna is different from what they say in Pennsylvania, right? And the one in Pennsylvania is actually closer to the one they know in Germany. Righty, righty, guily, alle Stunden meili. Das Männli geht ins Wartshaus, trinkt den Schäppli Wein raus. Das Mädli steht an der Wand, hat ein Gacki in der Hand. Hat's gern gebrode, s'is em net gerode. Hoch auf der Mauer, Holzäppel sauber, das Mäsli hockt unig im Dach, hat sich krumm und schepp verlacht. So it gets a little bit racier. I mean, it's not racy particularly, but it's a little bit of a racier version than what they have in Pennsylvania. Little bit different there. So some Kelowna tidbits for you. Now, when people think of Pennsylvania Dutch, and there are a lot of folks that kind of poke fun of the language and don't think much of the language, they say, well, it says hier verhuddeld, right? It says mixed, right? And they look at it and they say there are all these English words in there. If you sit down and you do a count of the words in Pennsylvania Dutch that come from English, it amounts to about 15% of the language. You think, well, is that very much? Well, let's take a look at German, the language spoken in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland today. What percentage of the language would you guess is borrowed, is taken from other languages in German? German spoken in Germany. Any guesses? Would you say that it's higher or lower than 15%? Yeah?
50%.
Say 50%. Oh, that's interesting. Any other guesses? It's 30%. So it's about double. So when people say that German is pure and Pennsylvania Dutch is verhuddeld and mixed, they got it all wrong. Pennsylvania Dutch is actually much purer if you want to consider purity of language. And to think that this language has been cut off from contact from Germany and for the most part fresh immigration for several generations now, and all of its speakers have been bilingual, that's a very, very modest percentage. Take a look at this quote here. This is from the first description of Pennsylvania Dutch ever made, and it's very early. It's in a book that was published in 1788 by a German visitor. He was a scholar who came to America, or the colonies before the Revolution, stayed, and then was left in about the mid-1700s, moved back to Germany. And he was fascinated by this language, which at that point was quite new, right? It was really the first generation of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. And so what he did was, this is not a very auspicious beginning in terms of the image of Pennsylvania Dutch. His first sentence to describe the language, and this is the first sentence we have by anybody, is, I'll read it in German here. Die Sprache, deren sich unsere deutsche Landesleute bedienen, ist ein erbärmlich gerader, rechter Mischmasch der englischen und deutschen in Ansehung der Worte sowohl als ihrer Fügungen. So he's saying, this sounds like a mess. It's a mishmash of English and German. But again, he was not sitting down to do the math and count it up and to realize that the number of words was actually quite modest. Now, if you go to southeastern Pennsylvania today, you can buy books like this, right? And there are folks that believe that Pennsylvania Dutch is in fact not German connected at all. It's just silly English, right? Throw Johnny down the stairs his hat, right? Throw Mama from the train a kiss, right? You've heard these things. As with most stereotypes, there's a germ of truth there. Yeah, some folks have talked a little bit Dutchy sometimes, right? When they're using English, but not nearly as much as you would think in buying books like this. But this kind of thing draws in tourists. It's entertaining, right? It sells. And so you can go, how many folks have been to Lancaster County before? I'm guessing a fair number. You stop in places like Bird in Hand and Intercourse and so forth, and you go in this, I mean, you see things like this on tea trivets and towels and salt and pepper shakers with Amish grandma and grandpa on it and so forth. It's all kind of silly stuff, but it's something that's marketed to tourists, right? But there are a lot of things that they're not interested in doing sort of objective work. It's just simply to make a buck. So what's the story with speaking English? Well, as I say, there's a germ of truth. Into the early 20th century, if you were an active speaker of Pennsylvania Dutch, if that was the language that you spoke most frequently, it's quite likely that you did not speak English as much. Now, it's fair to say that every single Pennsylvania Dutch speaker was bilingual, but they weren't ambilingual. They weren't balanced. So they were if they were speaking Pennsylvania Dutch actively, that meant that they were speaking a little bit less English. So it was quite common in the 1800s and into the 1900s for folks to have what we call a Dutchy accent. So like pronouncing a word like job as chop. He's doing a good chop. He's doing a good chop, right? You'll recognize this. There were certain words, actually, that were transferred from Pennsylvania Dutch into the regional English, especially in Pennsylvania. You go around, and there's folks that have no connection to Pennsylvania Dutch whatsoever. Could you go spritz the flowers for me, please? Right? The cake is all, right? The kuchen is alle, right? Things like that. And, you know, translations of various other things as well. So there's a little bit of this transfer of Pennsylvania Dutch into English. And in the other direction, because everybody was speaking English to some degree, there were some of those words that were coming in. And the oldest word that we found that was borrowed from English into Pennsylvania Dutch is fence. Now, why would you guess that the word fence was borrowed from English into Pennsylvania Dutch? Any guesses? Why fence? I mean, it makes sense a word like computer or space shuttle, but what about a fence? Sorry?
Had no fences.
They had no fences. If you marked your property in Germany, you marked it with maybe, at best, a stone wall, but typically you had ditches, right, often filled with water, or you planted rows of trees, or you had hedgerows. Fences in the sort of American colonial and certainly modern sense did not exist to mark property boundaries in Germany, certainly throughout Europe. And so this was a new piece of technology to early immigrants to colonial Pennsylvania, even for the Brits, right? This was something that was new. So it made perfect sense that they would borrow a word for something that they had no correlation with in Germany. Now things changed in the 20th century, such as today, that it was basically around the 1930s, 1940s, when you start to have greater contact between plain people and outsiders. And that's only increased, especially as the number of plain people who farm as their main source of income has decreased dramatically. So in places like northern Indiana, they're working in the factories. In places like here in Iowa, it's businesses, small industries, cottage industries, working a lot more in contact with certainly customers, or in the case of Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, co-workers, right? Working in places where English is the dominant language. And so you start to see that right-hand bar, the proficiency in English, go up. So there's been much less Dutchification today among a lot of speakers. So if you were to hear, like, for example, a native speaker of Pennsylvania Dutch who's Amish or older Mennonite speaking on the phone, and you had no clue that they spoke a language other than English as their first language, you would not be able to detect an accent at all, right? Now there is one exception, and that's the so-called Schwarzentruber Amish. Schwarzentruber Amish, of whom there are some, I believe, here in Iowa, right? Not many, definitely some in Minnesota, like in Fillmore County, Minnesota, and up by us in Wisconsin. Schwarzentruber Amish split off of the old orders in 1907, and they're highly traditional. And their interaction with English speakers is much less than among the rest of Amish, of old order Amish certainly. And so their maintenance of their situation is still pretty much like all Pennsylvania Dutch speakers were in the 19th century. That is that they speak Pennsylvania Dutch natively and actively and really don't use English all that much. And so it's not true for all of them, but for many Schwarzentroopers, if you hear them speaking English, you still hear that kind of Dutchy accent. Their proficiency in English is much weaker. Now, part of my work at the university is involved with public outreach, right? And it's also something that is a connection to my faith as well. I feel that it's something that's important for me to kind of share what I've got in my professional life and in my spiritual life, also with the greater community. And it's part of what we also refer to at our university as the Wisconsin idea. The idea that we shouldn't be just kind of holed up in some ivory tower somewhere. We should also be trying to do something that will bring good to the public. And so several years ago, I was called upon to start doing some translation. So I do things like, for example, in interpretation in court settings. I do work in, for example, interviews if it's involved, for example, with plain children who are preschool aged or not comfortable with speaking English. I do a lot of outreach that involves medical outreach, so working with things that kind of running interference for plain folks, and hospitals, like the big hospital that we have at at our university. And I've been especially involved with Schwarzentroopers and helping Schwarzentroopers out, kind of bridge the language gap. And at the same time, a lot of, especially you've seen this mainly in government offices and at hospital networks and medical insurance companies, that you're seeing a greater interest in reaching out to their plain populations, which are growing so rapidly, to translate materials into Pennsylvania Dutch. And one of the folks here tonight brought in a copy of his insurance forms, and you've got Pennsylvania Dutch listed there with several other languages. To say for the Schwarzentroopers in legal and medical contexts, it's often necessary to have some help with that. But what's probably most important is not so much the language interpretation, but what I refer to as cultural mediation. Especially being able to explain to people in law enforcement, the judicial system, and medical professionals who don't really understand who plain people are, where the plain people are coming from, in terms of the decisions that they make about their own legal status, their health, and especially how the decisions that they make on behalf of their children, because that's where it can be sort of a point of controversy or contact. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of translations, many of those of you who do have medical insurance will see these flyers that come out, and sure enough, Pennsylvania Dutch is recognized up there too. It's not an officially recognized language by the federal government in any way. There's no money that goes to support this, but it is something that's recognized by a lot of businesses and health insurance companies especially as an important part of their outreach programs. Now, to kind of wrap things up, I want to share with you first a quote that was formulated by an old order Amish man named Benuel Blank, and some of you with an interest in Amish history may recognize his name. He wrote a number of articles in the Pathway publications that are produced by Amish folks. He also wrote a book called The Amazing Story of the Ausbund. And the Ausbund, of course, is the famous Amish hymnal, the oldest hymnal used in the world. Benuel Blank was a very, very thoughtful Amish man from Lancaster. And I want to share with you a quote that he had about language that I think expresses the importance of maintaining Pennsylvania Dutch and German to conserving the spiritual heritage that the old orders have done. Knowing two languages is a privilege God has provided for us, and we can put them to good use. Although we have a knowledge of two languages, it would be wrong not to make an effort to express ourselves better in the English language. But it would be just as wrong to fail to keep and pass on the German to our children. That rich language our forebears left for us. It is a well-known fact that losing our mother tongue and drifting into the world usually go together. Anytime we speak English around the home, when just family members are around, or while working or visiting with others who know Pennsylvania Dutch, we put in a vote to drop a rich heritage that will never be brought back if we lose it. The value of that heritage is so great that we can't afford to lose it. And I mentioned before that the complete scripture has now been translated as of 2013 into Pennsylvania Dutch. The man that did this is named Henry Hirschberger, who grew up in an Amish family, did not continue being a member of the church. His wife was also of Amish background, and they became fairly mission-minded and took an interest in language. And so they were affiliated with the Wycliffe Society to do Bible translation. And the Wycliffe Society sent them to Australia, of all places. And for 25 years they were working with Aboriginal languages, the indigenous languages of Australia. And at some point Hank and Ruth said, you know, here we are doing all this work to translate the Word of God into the language of people that we're dedicated to but are not our people, and no one has ever done the same for our heritage language. And so they got a committee of native speakers together, a blend of old orders and folks of Amish background who were native speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch. It was called the Committee for Translation. One of the first things they produced was that book of Bible stories for children, Veleresa. Their Wycliffe Society is very good about insisting that you translate the Bible from the original tongues. So for the Old Testament, it's got to be Hebrew, the New Testament, Greek. So you can't go from English or Martin Luther, German. It's got to be from the original languages. For the New Testament, it didn't take that long. They were done from the 1970s to the early 1990s. The Old Testament, Hebrew, it's a good bit longer. It took many more years, and it took another 20 years, but they finished in 2013. The product is known as Die Heilige Schrift, the Holy Scripture. And if you order it, you can also get a little booklet that comes with it. Ich kann Pennsylvania Dutch lesen, right? It basically teaches you how to read follow the spelling rules for Pennsylvania Dutch. And the last image I'm going to share with you, this is something where I think you'll be familiar with. This is the 23rd Psalm, which is probably my favorite psalm. I'm going to read it to you in Pennsylvania Dutch. And I want you to realize how important this language is as a vehicle, not just simply for transacting business and telling silly stories. It can be just as important for expressing a vehicle for expressing one's spirituality as any other language. De haas mij zoveel. Ich hab gar kein Not. Lasst mich anleihen, grüne Weid. Fährt mich ans Frischwasser. Gebt mij sehr neue Kräfte. Fährt mich in die rechte Pade, für das Segen von seinem Namen. Und even wann ich durch die tief dunkle Schade vom Tod lauf, dann fürchte ich mich nicht, weil du bei mir bist. Der Stock und Stecker drehst du mich. Du richten dich für mich, fand ich meine Feinde. Du salbst mein Kopf mit Öl. Mein Kopfli läuft immer. Gutes und Barmherzigkeit sei bei mir sei mein Leben lang. Und ich bleibe im sein Haus für immer. All right. Thank you for coming up, Heichen. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, sir.
How common is the Pennsylvania Dutch Bible used in their worship services? Well, it was always German.
I'll repeat the question. How common, or is it common, for the Pennsylvania Dutch Bible to be used in worship services? It is not used in worship services, right? Because basically you only use the Luther German version, translation of the Bible, or the New Testament, and the Auskund is in German, and the prayer books are always in German. The Pennsylvania Dutch translation of the Bible has not made strong inroads among the old orders, but it is something that you find on many folks' shelves. Let me give you an example. I lived in Gonzales, Texas for 12 years in an Amish community. Gonzales was a very, very small community of folks mainly from the Midwest, including some folks that had connections to Iowa, especially Buchanan County. And there was just one member of the ministry there. There was a minister named Joe Hirschberger, who was originally from Buck County, then moved to New Glarus, and then moved down to Texas from there. And Joe was, became a minister in New Glarus, and was not super strong in German when he became a minister. His dad was a bishop, was up in Clare, Michigan, a little bit stronger in German. And so Joe had some little bit of catching up to do with his German. I mean, he had heard German in church all his life, but he wasn't so strong in that. And so, and he knew that every Sunday, because unless there were visitors there, it was going to be up to him to be doing everything, the short sermon and the long sermon, and reading from Scripture. And so the way that he prepared was he knew what scriptures were going to be coming up the next day, and he read first in the language that he understood best, which was English. And then the next version was in the Pennsylvania Dutch translation. And then from Pennsylvania Dutch he went to High German. He says, I can read English best, my goal is to get to German, and Pennsylvania Dutch makes a very, very nice bridge. And so for him, it was a nice study aid. And if you think about it, it's not, the intent of the Pennsylvania Dutch Bible is not to replace the Luther German, or to replace the King James English, or New Revised Standard Version, or whatever. It's just to add yet another version on the plate, right? So that people have one more access, one more way to get at the Word of God. So even though it will probably never find popularity in actual Old Order worship services, I think it can provide a sort of nice supplement to Old Order spiritual life. Any other questions?
So as you listen to Pennsylvania Dutch speakers in, say, Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Ohio, Pennsylvania, do you hear difference in how they talk?
By and large, for a Lancaster speaker, it all sounds like Western Dutch. And the main difference between Pennsylvania Dutch, and Midwestern is the pronunciation of the sound I. So like in the name Deutsch, right, which means Dutch or Pennsylvania German. In Pennsylvania you say Deutsch. In the Midwest you say Dutch, right? So you'd say 3 Dutch women in Pennsylvania, 3 Deutsche Weibsleid. In the Midwest, slag. You also roll that R in most places. Now the differences between Indiana and Illinois and Ohio and so forth, they're not huge differences. But what's interesting when you mention specifically Texas, and there aren't many Amish left in Texas, but there are a fair number in Oklahoma, is that you hear the southern twang in their Pennsylvania Dutch. And that's a carryover from their English, right? And I actually heard that today when we were talking to Herman. Herman originally comes from Thomas, Oklahoma, and all of a sudden I was hearing, when he was telling stories about Oklahoma, I was hearing that twang, his Oklahoma twang coming through in his Pennsylvania Dutch. But other than that, they're not huge differences. Any other questions? Yes?
That Joe Hirschberger lives in Shoto, Oklahoma now.
Yes, he does.
That's where I grew up.
You grew up in Shoto, no kidding. Did you know Bishop Chris Miller then?
Yeah,
Chris
he
Daugherty?
baptized me.
That's neat. Any other questions? For those of you that know some Pennsylvania Dutch, how easy was that poem to understand that I read, the Bush and Stettel? Fairly easy? A little bit, kind of, sort of. Yes, sir.
It was easier to understand than it was for me to read it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right, well, thank you so much for coming this evening. I really appreciate your coming out. Oh, just to kind of, if you're curious, to learn more about Pennsylvania Dutch, I've written a book about Pennsylvania Dutch. For those of you that are familiar with Don Crable and his series of books on Anabaptist studies, it's in Don Crable's series. It appeared 3 years ago in hardcover at a relatively hefty price. And as of next Tuesday, it's coming out in paperback for a much more modest price. It's a 500-page book. It's the history of Pennsylvania Dutch. It covers, from soup to nuts. It goes from the very, very beginning, the roots in Germany, all the way to the present. And the publisher sent me some cards. You get a 20% discount if you're interested in ordering from a publisher. So if you were interested in acquiring a copy for a 20% discount, it's not profits that go to me. They go back eventually to Elizabethtown College, the Young Center. If you're interested, you're welcome to talk to me afterwards.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your presentation to us. And if anybody wants one of these cards for a 20% discount, why see me or see Mark. We do have cookies and beverage out there in the fellowship hall, so at this time we can adjourn the mill around there, and you can talk to Mark some more about whatever questions you might have. So thank you very much for coming. Let's give Mark a hand. You are adjourned. Yeah, if you want to head toward that.
Yeah.